What's going on, guys? Mr. Collins here, bringing you another episode of the podcast, Let's Talk History. Today I'm joined with Nick.
I'm Nick.
And today we're really just going to do a synopsis over our 35th president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy is one of those presidents that if you ask somebody, who's your favorite president? They're going to say.
Yeah, they don't really have a reason though.
They don't have a reason why it's Kennedy, but a lot of times people are like, oh, well, I'm a fan of John F. Kennedy. So today we are going to break down who John F. Kennedy was and why he might be some people's favorite president. So starting off with his early life, he was a pretty sickly kid. He really didn't have a good start like most did. He was born May 29th, 1917, and he actually had a disease called Addison's disease.
Made him hard to breathe.
Made him not really just hard to breathe, but it was more like an autoimmune disease. So it was something where like he got sick very easily. He was very susceptible to being sick. And he was a very sickly kid. He was very shy, had many siblings, had that, regular nuclear family like people would think of. His father was Joseph Kennedy. And Joseph Kennedy actually worked with the FDR administration and was the ambassador to the United Kingdom. So you can already tell starting off that this dude has a silver platter. I mean, he's born with money. Mm-hmm. Like, he's a very prominent guy. So later on in his life, he actually, I believe he went to, I think it was Harvard maybe. It was one of those prestigious colleges. But he ends up going to college. It could not be Harvard. But he ends up going to college, and later on in his life, he actually goes to war in World War II.
Wasn't his brother in war as well?
His brother was also there with him. And his brother was actually killed in World War II. And this was pretty upsetting, and it actually shook the family to its core. Because his brother, I don't want to say he was the favorite, but the father was almost, almost like the favorite, yeah. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was almost grooming JFK's brother to become what JFK ended up becoming, what he ended up blossoming into. But his brother gets killed in World War II, and the next in line for the grooming to happen to was John F. Kennedy, nicknamed Jack Kennedy. He spent time in World War II as well, just like his brother. His boat actually sunk in World War II.
This is leading up to his hero story pretty much, right?
Yeah, so this is kind of leading up to what gave him that, I guess, romanticized view from people. His boat sunk. It was sunk by a Japanese destroyer. And the name of that boat, I think, was PT-109. And he actually swam a lot of his crewmates to shore and saved a lot of them. And, I mean, just talk about a war hero in that. So he got medals for that. And after he got out, he decided to run for Congress. So this is when his political career really starts, is after World War II. So John F. Kennedy, he becomes a representative in the Boston district in Massachusetts. And he tried to represent more of the working class, more of the blue-collar individuals, because it is those individuals that run the United States, those truck drivers, those factory workers. He tried to have almost that sort of persona in his campaign, and it worked because he ended up getting elected. He spends time in Congress, and one thing leads to another, and he actually gets the Democratic presidential nominee in 1960. Now, you got to understand the era that we're talking about right now. After World War II, Russia, not our friends. Definitely not somebody that we would be shaking hands with at a ball game. Yeah, so we were constantly in something called the Cold War. So during this Cold War, this was essentially a huge competition of whose nuke is bigger than whose nuke.
Yeah, it wasn't really a war. Most people think it is, but it's like a race pretty much, right?
More or less, yeah. I mean, there was no actual battles fought during the Cold War. It was more of a arms race is what it's considered. And this is during his campaign for president. So it's a very tough time in American politics to be running for any kind of office, but he does. In 1960, he actually does get the nominee, and he gets to debate the Republican nominee, which is Richard Nixon, which later became president. Richard Nixon, he is pretty prominent at this point. He was the vice president under Eisenhower, and he was amazing with foreign relations. Like, anything you needed to know as far as foreign policy, you would ask Nixon. Later presidents actually asked Nixon for advice when dealing with foreign policy. You know, regardless of your opinion on Nixon, nobody can dispute the fact that he was a great person when dealing with other countries. So that's who JFK is running up against. And on top of all this political anguish, he's Catholic. So
First Catholic president.
Yeah, he later would become the first Catholic president, but he first had to overcome that. And it wasn't easy. He had to do a lot of front porch campaigning, is what they call it, literally going to front porches of people and shaking hands, reassuring them that, hey, even though I'm Catholic, that's not going to intervene with anything that has to do with my office as president of the United States. So just immediately he's showing a lot of distinction with himself, just being a different candidate.
Wasn't Kennedy the first one to president whose election to be broadcasted on TV? Because at first they were on radios.
Yeah.
And during the radio said something. They said Nixon won, but on the other one it said Kennedy won.
Yeah.
On the TV.
So playing off what Nick said there, before there was television, there was radio. Radio was the basic form of communication, whether that's music, whether that's news, baseball games, whatever. That's how information was communicated. Before radio, there was newspaper. I mean, there wasn't anything as far as digital goes besides radio. Well, once televisions got a lot more popular, that's when the 1960 presidential debate between Nixon and Kennedy is the first one to be aired. And that was a big deal because, like Nick was saying, if you actually watched that debate, you thought hands down Kennedy was the winner. But if you were able to actually listen to that debate on the radio, you assumed that Nixon was the winner. The reason this was is because you couldn't see them on the radio. But Nixon, the story goes,
he wasn't looking too hot.
He wasn't looking too hot. He just, when he was getting out of the vehicle to walk in to this center where they were going to debate, he bumps his leg on his door of the vehicle he got out of.
Hurts it really bad.
Hurts real bad, and he was visibly in pain.
He was wiping sweat off his face.
I mean, he was terrible. I mean, he was just really in bad shape, but he was still willing to come there and, finish out the debate. I know I've hit my shin a few times, and especially if you hit it on the hitch of a trailer or anything like that, it's enough to make a grown man cry. So I can understand where Nixon's coming from on this one. But kind of going in chronological order here, this debate happens. JFK really shows himself to be a competent opponent to Nixon. A lot of people just assumed that Nixon would sweep the nation, but after the results came out, it ended up that, Kennedy won the 1960 election. And later on, next year in 61, he took the office after his inaugural address. But immediately going into office, he's facing just terrible, terrible things.
Throughout his entire life, he's been going through a lot. First, it was his World War II. He's been in a lot of wars, like the Bay of Pigs disaster, the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah,
He's been through a lot.
A lot of scuffles, almost.
Was it Vietnam too?
He was dead by Vietnam, but he had some things to do with Vietnam, and we'll get there in a second. But immediately he gets elected, and Cuba starts ramping up their nuclear missiles, and this is a byproduct of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. America did not like that Cuba had missiles. So the response to that was Kennedy was kind of overseeing this initiative, I guess you could say, where a bunch of Cuban exiles, people who had been exiled from Cuba, were sent down back to Cuba to start a revolution, to try to overthrow Fidel Castro. This was a huge mistake and a huge blunder on Kennedy's resume. He really was shaking his head after this one. And a lot of people like to blame Kennedy for this, but it was actually Eisenhower who started that idea.
Yeah.
A lot of times the current president gets blamed for things that were already in place from the previous president. That's just how American politics work. But Bay of Pigs happened. It's just a huge disaster, and on top of all the things that were going on in the Cold War, things just start getting worse now. This leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where this is probably one of the times where we almost got ourselves blown up.
Yeah, one of the closest times in history that humankind has almost ended everything.
There is this idea of mutually assured destruction, MAD for short. And the idea like, okay, well, let's just nuke the Soviet Union first. Sounds good on paper, but then they're going to nuke us back. And all these civilians are going to die, and was it really worth it? Well, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was a span of about 2 weeks where everybody in the world was thinking, you know what, this is the end. Because the idea of nuclear war had never been more prevalent than those 2 weeks. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, and this is just like in the first year, 2 years into his presidency. As far as the Vietnam issue goes, Vietnam was an issue with Eisenhower. Vietnam was a colony of France, and Vietnam did not want to be a colony of France. And furthermore, there's this idea of the domino theory, where all this communism that was circling the world, if it was to get into Southeast Asia, it would be like the dominoes tipping over.
Yeah, it'd be bad things would happen.
It would be bad. It would be bad. And America wanted to intervene so that didn't happen. Kennedy, on the other hand, did not feel it was right to send American troops to Vietnam. He thought it would be a very bad situation. So instead, he sent aid. He sent a lot of supplies to the Vietnamese that were under the impression of communism. Other than that, though, he was very adamant about just keeping people out of Vietnam. After he dies, his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, thought differently. But that's for another episode. Just continuing on, though, Kennedy was this young person. He had a wife who, by the looks of things, seemed to love him. It's known now that he was a ladies' man, and it was probably more of a platonic relationship between each other. They probably didn't actually have a lot of love for each other due to Kennedy's love of other women. But from the American standpoint, though, or just the world standpoint, they were in love, and the White House was just on cloud nine. A lot of times it's referred to as Camelot, like the idea of Camelot from King Arthur's tale, and just all this perfection happening. But all that came to an end. Mm-hmm. In Houston, yeah. So in Texas, actually it was Dallas. I think it was Dallas, Texas, where his assassination happened. So in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is riding in a open town car, Lincoln town car, with the governor of Texas, Governor Connolly, and there's a shot that is heard from a building kind of to the behind of the vehicle.
Kennedy gets hit in the neck.
He gets hit in the neck, and he tells the people who he was sitting with. He was sitting right next to his wife, Jackie, and he kind of rubs his neck, and he's like, man, you know, I've been hit. And then the second shot hits. You can watch that on YouTube. It's called the Zapruder film. It's a very gory film, but the whole idea of Camelot, the whole idea of them being just perfect and him being such a great president kind of came to an end with that. Because when he was shot November 22nd, 1963, immediately sworn into office just a few hours later was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it was up to him to try to pick up the pieces. So he creates something called the Warren Commission, and this was an investigation into the assassination. All while this is going on, Lee Harvey Oswald gets assassinated himself by a man named Jack Ruby. So this is where you start getting into, if you look up John F. Kennedy, the first thing that's going to pop up a lot of times is conspiracy theory.
Yeah, there's tons of them.
Yes, and we didn't bring our tinfoil hats today, so we're probably not going to get into any conspiracy theories.
Not this episode.
Not this episode, maybe another one, but we're just going to stick with what we know. And as far as public documents, there isn't a lot we do know. There could be a lot that happened with that assassination, and we simply just have no idea what happened. What we do know is that Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy. Kennedy died. Lyndon Baines Johnson took over. Oswald himself was shot, and that's the end. Don't want to go too much more into the conspiracy theories, but kind of just bringing Kennedy to an end. He was a short-lived president. You can make speculations whether or not he would have gone for re-election or not, but let's kind of talk about his legacy for a second. He introduced to the White House this idea that the White House can be this perfect aurora of just Camelot, like I was saying. He introduced the idea that you can be a president and you can kind of abide by your own jurisdiction and make decisions by the use of your cabinet. You know, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a lot of discussion going on, what we should do next. He was a very prominent figure and remains a very prominent figure in politics even today. If you hear a lot of congressional debates that happen, his name gets thrown around a lot. That's just how it is, and that's probably how it will always be. He goes down in the book as one of the best presidents by many people. If you were to Google top 10 best presidents, he's probably on that list. A lot of times, though, people just don't understand that because he was only president for 2 to 3 years. He was in office from 61 to 63. So there wasn't a lot of time for him to get stuff done, but just from my opinion, as far as all the presidents, he got more done than some others. And we may do an episode later on about some of the worst presidents we've ever had from history. But regardless, is there anything you want to add? Anything?
Well, we could start getting into the fun facts, and
okay.
one of them would be the iconic limo iconic limo that most presidents drive with the bulletproof glass. It wasn't until after his assassination people were like, that people might want to kill the president, so they invented bulletproof glass in the cars of presidents. And what car was it that he was driving?
It was a Lincoln Town Car. He was being drove in.
It wasn't that like the standard president car?
At the time, yes, but it makes you wonder, how come they didn't think of this before? The president of the United States, you're arguably the most powerful person in the world. There's been political assassinations for years before Kennedy. How come they didn't think about this? Just one of those things. I know when I was a kid growing up, I played a lot of Call of Duty, and there wasn't anything, me being a kid who loved history, I loved playing the Zombies map on Black Ops 1. It was called 5, and you could actually play as John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon on there as well.
Yeah, actually, the only reason my little brother Ethan, the only reason he knows about Kennedy, his favorite president is Kennedy. I asked him how did he even know him? And he said Call of Duty. So.
Yeah, and I would say that, honestly, from my perspective too, that's how I learned about John F. Kennedy as well, from Call of Duty. He was also, as we mentioned earlier, he was the first Catholic president, and he was also the youngest president to be elected to president.
40, right?
Yeah, he was 42, somewhere around there. He was in his early 40s, but Teddy Roosevelt was actually the youngest president ever, but he only became president because William McKinley was assassinated. So he became president by default, whereas Kennedy became president legitimately.
Yeah.
But as far as John F. Kennedy goes as a whole, we really just scratched the surface on what he stood for. I mean, you could go into detail about his civil rights impact. You could go into detail about his foreign policy with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union.
There's a lot to talk about.
There's so much to talk about. The point of this episode was really just to squeeze in as much as we could to give you listeners and watchers just an idea of who is the real John F. Kennedy. So it's good to be back. Glad to be back with Nick. And as always, keep learning history. We're signing off.